Hi, welcome to another episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. So, just what are the legacies of slavery? Our guest today will be helping us to understand how universities were entangled in the slave trade. Welcome to a continuation of our episode with Dr. Afua Cooper. Please continue to support us by clicking on your subscription and notification buttons. Thank you. Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series, Dr. Afua Cooper. Yeah, and you've been very busy in that area of looking at the connections between your university, Dalhousie University, and slave wealth. Please, can you share some of the findings? I know that you identified 5 specific ways, in which Dalhousie University was entangled with the slave trade.
Yes, definitely. So in 2019, we released a report on Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race. So the university where I teach, which is called Dalhousie University, it was named after Lord Dalhousie, who was the governor of Nova Scotia from 1816 to 1820. He was from Scotland. He was a soldier. He's a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. He reached the highest rank in the British Army, general. And so after the wars were over, he came to Nova Scotia in 1816 to take up the governorship. And so during that time, the university was founded, and it was named after him. The university was founded in 1818. So both we looked at, I led a team of people in which we looked at the role of the university itself and also the founder of the university. And both of them are called Dalhousie. Dalhousie is the noble name because he's a member of the nobility, the Scottish nobility. So it's their name. You could say his ordinary name was George Ramsay, but his noble name was Dalhousie.
I didn't know.
Yeah. So, when they enter the peerage, then they get these noble names. So we did this investigation, and there are so many ways that I discovered the university and the man was linked to slavery, and I'll just discuss briefly 5 of these entanglements. And the first is the invasion of Martinique in 1794. In 1794, we have the Napoleonic Wars, the Revolutionary Wars. The French Revolution was going on. The enslaved people in Haiti and Martinique and Guadeloupe and other French colonies also rose up in rebellion against their slave masters and the French colonizers. And so in the Martinicans, they did that. Britain and France was fighting on the continent, but of course the wars spilled over to the Caribbean because that was where most of the colonies were. And these were very rich colonies. Martinique produced so much wealth for France that France valued Martinique more than it valued Canada. And that's why in 1763, France gave up Canada in exchange for Martinique. This was one of the, the workings out of the 7 Years' War. So in 1794, Britain invaded Martinique. As I said, the Black Martinicans had risen up. Britain wanted to take over the island and reinstate slavery. Colonel Dalhousie, at the time he was colonel, led the invasion. He was one of the people who led the British invasion of Martinique and reinstated slavery. So there's this man putting down Black freedom, reinstated slavery on the island. A second entanglement was with Lord Dalhousie's relationship with the Black refugees of the War of 1812. Different time period, different context. We are now in North America. The British and the Americans fought the War of 1812. Many African Americans who were enslaved on plantations joined the British standard. And they fought for the British. They became sailors. They were spies. They showed the British how to, come on land and attack the Americans.
Because they promised them freedom if they won.
They promised them freedom. They said, when the war ended, you'll be free. And they did evacuate 3,000 to Nova Scotia, 3,000 of the Black refugees who came at the time. Lord Dalhousie arrived in Nova Scotia to become governor. But this man didn't like Black people. Remember, he was in Martinique crushing the freedom movement there. He saw Nova Scotia when he arrived in 1816 as a white man's colony. He said, I don't want these Black people here. I want white settlers to come from Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland and even Germany and Switzerland. I don't want these Black people. So he tried to deport them. And to Trinidad, to Sierra Leone, he even came up with this bizarre idea that he would write to their slave masters in the United States and beg pardon for them, and then they could go back to slavery. So clearly this man was pro-slavery. He wasn't anti-slavery. And when he couldn't get the Black people to Nova Scotia, he basically starved them.
Yeah.
Because the British Crown, for anyone, any refugee coming in at that time, white, Black, it didn't matter. They were promised 2 years of support, meaning food, seeds, material to make tents, clothing, boots, coats. And he cut their rations. He cut their rations. They were to get how many pounds of beef, how many pounds of flour. He cut it in half. And then he said he would only give rations to people who were industrious. And then and we know this because of the letters he would write to his superiors in London. And then, then he visited one of the settlements of the Black refugees in Preston, and he said, I have to start giving them rations again because they are starving and they will not do well in the winter if they have no food. This is what he wrote in his letter. So we're not making up stories. So he starved the Black refugees when they wouldn't leave, when they wouldn't go willingly to the places he wanted them to go. And eventually 95 of them in 1820 did leave and go to Trinidad. I think they all should have left, actually. But at the same time, I understand their...
The set of
30 years before, a whole group left Nova Scotia and went to Sierra Leone. So you can see the habit, you can see the pattern here, which goes back to my first point about the legacies of slavery, is of the unbelonging. You do not belong here. You're not British subjects. We won't honor the promise of the British. And he believed in the ideology of Black inferiority. That's Lord Dalhousie. He said Black people were biologically inferior. So how could you trust a man who, as the governor of a province, who as an official of the British Crown, who was tasked with the responsibility of making sure that the Black refugees were looked after, and his response was to starve them and to insult them? How could you really can't trust such a person and his associates to do good on behalf of the Black people? And I'm thinking, so this university is established. Do you think any Black person gonna be allowed to go to that university? But let's get to the third point, which I talked about, and this was the West India trade. When I talk about the commercial link between the maritime colonies and the Caribbean colonies. So and it was premised on the saltfish and the rum trade, right? So many Halifax merchants and mercantile families made their fortunes from the West Indian trade. Some of them were connected to the university. Some of them were governors of the board, on the board of governors. Some of them were trustees, and not just Dalhousie, but also King's College University, which is a sister school to Dalhousie. You find some of the same people They are on the board of trustees at King's. They are on the board of trustees at Dalhousie. And many of these people were merchants, were very wealthy businessmen who made their fortune out of the slavery system. A fourth way that the university was connected to slavery was a compensation award. Remember, I said after the British government compensated the slave owners. Well, we know that the Johnston Almond family, which is a very prominent family in Nova Scotia, the street is named after one of them. They're a political family, they're a business family, they're a medical family. So many of them became doctors. They received compensation money. I thought, well, how could they have received compensation money? They're in Nova Scotia. Well, through the Johnson branch, they owned a slave plantation, as far as you know, could be more, but at least one in Jamaica. Because the Johnson family, it's a white planter class family, originally came from Jamaica and settled in Nova Scotia, but they still had their plantation connections to Jamaica. So here you have a Dalhousie Board of Governors receiving compensation for slavery, for the loss of their slave property. And the fifth connection had to do with the American Confederacy. So, you know, in 1861, the American Civil War started, which was basically over slavery. The North and the South divided. The American Union was compromised. The states that broke away from the Union formed what is known as the Confederacy. These are the Confederate states. When you had people in Halifax and other maritime places that supported the Confederacy. Now remember, the Confederacy wants to keep slavery. They don't want slavery to end, right? And you know, in all fairness, there were many Canadians that supported the Union, and many Canadian men, black and white, did leave Canada and went to the United States to fight on the side of the Union. That is true. But there were many more that supported the Confederacy. The Almond family, again, it's a medical family. They sent 2 doctors to work in the Confederate Army. The Almond family, and one of them, who was the first dean for Dalhousie Medical School, he was a very prominent doctor in Halifax. He would keep balls and parties and fundraising events to raise money for the Confederacy, to send it to Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, and Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. They supported Confederate ships coming to Halifax, and they would stock up the ships with supplies to take back to Virginia or wherever else to feed the Confederate troops. That happened in Canada. I mean, the hatch to kill President Abraham Lincoln, that plot rather was hatched in Montreal, right? Yeah. Just recently, the plaque for Jefferson Davis was removed from a sidewalk in Montreal. They had that plaque there for decades. But if we just take it back to Dalhousie University, someone like Dr. Almond, who started the medical school at Dalhousie, was a huge Confederate supporter, he and his wife, and there were many others. So it's like, wow, you have the university, Dalhousie University, you have the early leaders of the university, beginning with Lord Dalhousie, having these attitudes and these feelings and engaging these behaviors that disenfranchised the Black community. We know that it wasn't until toward the end of the 19th century, certainly the last 2 decades of the 19th century, that Black people actually could enter Dalhousie University as students. And it's still, it's not like you have tons of blacks roaming on campus to this day. It's still a small percentage of the population. I mean, the black student population.
This was just not something that happened in the university like Dalhousie alone.
Precisely. We were able to do the research for Dalhousie because in 2018 was the 200th anniversary of the founding of the school. And so, there were plans to have the parties and the commemorations, and 200 years, it's a big deal. But the elephant in the room was, wow, in this day and age, remember, it's 2018. It's the time we were talking about equity and anti-racism and anti-Black racism. So to just have this anniversary be one big celebration, celebrating Lord Dalhousie, when that guy was a racist, a true anti-Black racist. And so that didn't sit well with a lot of us. And, we had a Black faculty and staff caucus. We met with the president and we said, hey, the commemoration is great, but look it, Dalhousie was a racist. As a Black person, I couldn't just sit and participate in this commemoration without saying, this man harmed the Black people. He starved many of them to death. He tried to deport them. He thought that Black people were biologically inferior. And that was how the president, then Richard Florizone, and the chair of Senate, Kevin Hewitt, approved this inquiry. And, I took on the task. I led the panel that investigated, and I led the research team and subsequently wrote the report. And so that's how it happened at DAL. It was like the stars are aligned. You had the chair of Senate, you had a president who was in favor of it, and you had personnel with the staff or faculty who were ready and willing and able to go. So that was what happened at Dalhousie University. Now, other schools, we have inspired other schools. King's College University has also done their investigation, which is amazing. And I should say that both the report from Dalhousie University and King's College are online. People can go and read them and look at the recommendations. Now, McGill University has also taken up this work. As we speak, they are doing their own investigating, because McGill is also an old school. And the original endowment for McGill was left by John McGill, who was a slave owner and a slave trader. He was a fur trader, right? He's known as a huge fur trader, but he also owned enslaved people. The thing I should say, Bumi, is that, and this is important, and I didn't say it before when I was talking about the 5 entanglements, is that the money, the first endowment for Dalhousie University, the money that was used to establish the school, to build the buildings, to pay the professors, came from the Castine Fund. And the Castine Fund, Castine is in Maine.
Yeah.
And during the War of 1812, the Nova Scotians and the British went down there, captured Castine. It was a port town, and it had a toll. And the ships that came in from the West Indies, of course, New England was also involved in the Caribbean slave trade. So the ships that came in from the Caribbean, they had to pay their toll at Castine. And so the Nova Scotians, the military and the British military, they seized that box of money. And it amounted to about 12,000 Halifax pounds. Money was taken back to Nova Scotia. The governor had rights over that money. It was crown money. We think of it, we say it's federal funding, right? It belongs to the federal government. And it's from that money that Lord Dalhousie used. He actually used all of it, something like 9,000 pounds as part of the original endowment. The other 2,000 or 3,000 pounds was used to establish the military library, which is still going on. It's still current in Nova Scotia. And then the Nova Scotia legislature also gave Dalhousie University money from the tax fund to expand the university. Now, as I've stated earlier, most of the money that came in from taxes from the ships, that came in. You have to pay the toll, you have to pay tax. Yes, came from the West India trade. So whether it was original endowment or subsequent monies, Dalhousie University got these monies really from the Caribbean, from Caribbean slavery. So that's an important point.
It is in fact, it's a point that we must not lose sight of.
Yeah.
Because, like we said, we've been talking mostly about Dalhousie University, but if you look all around, not just even in North America, all around Europe, you can actually trace, these kinds of connections from slavery, slave wealth, to the endowment of universities. So what can universities, do? What can they begin to do?
Well, they can begin to do what the University of Glasgow has done, for example. University of Glasgow, which so many of its founders and benefactors were slave owners and businessmen who got their money from slavery, worked out this memorandum of understanding with the University of the West Indies. And they have committed 20 million pounds, 20 million British pounds to help in things like technology transfer, infrastructure development with the University of the West Indies. So that's one way. I mean, they have done a comprehensive report where they kind of really zeroed in on the money. So that's one way. Dalhousie University is looking at curricular development, so the establishment of a BA program in Black Studies, which I'm part of that team developing that program. So we have a minor in Black Studies at Dalhousie. It's now been turned into a major, and we want to do a Black Studies bachelor's degree, eventually expanded so you can have a graduate component, because it's at the graduate level where a lot of research is done, and we want to continue that research. So that's one way, investing in curriculum, bringing more Black students to the campus, helping to fund and support their undergraduate education, helping to support graduate education. Graduate education is expensive. It's in graduate school, you're there for a long time if you're doing a PhD. And we just had a whole bunch of scholarships at Dalhousie for Black students, whether they're African Nova Scotian, whether they're African, Caribbean people on campus, whether they're from Africa as international students. We just launched the Sankofa scholarships, which is fantastic. And the initiative or these scholarships came out of the recommendations of the Lord Dalhousie report. We have 13 recommendations there. So that's one way. We are hoping to have cluster hire. You have to hire Black faculty. You can have a Black studies program and just one or two people in it. So targeted hires, cluster hires are important.
Hire enough of them, just make it, hire enough, people of color to make a real difference. Not just add a few.
Hire them. Yeah, exactly. Hire them and retain them. I'm gonna go, because that's the other thing. If people come, if you hire them and then they're not happy, they're gonna go, they're gonna leave. And retention is important. So I just wanna read out here some of our recommendations. And the first one is important. It says, expressing regret for the institutions and its founders' connection to slavery and anti-Black racism, past and present, and acknowledging the responsibility to take steps against anti-Black racism. When this report was launched in September 2019, the first thing that the acting president did was to issue that apology.
Yeah, it's important.
The apology was issued, and so that's important. We felt that we couldn't go forward until we got that apology, and we grouped the recommendations under regret and responsibility under these rubrics: regret and responsibility, recognition, repair, and repair. And we're talking about reparatory justice. So not just reparations as a word, but reparatory justice, to establish an institute for the study of slavery and abolition. And, you know, like I said, the report is on the website, so people can go read the report and make themselves familiar with our recommendations. We also talk about linking institutions of higher learning in the West Indies to Nova Scotia, skills transfer, infrastructure development, so on and so forth. Because we recognize that we've talked about throughout the report that Nova Scotia got its wealth really from the West Indies. And so Dalhousie University, the province of Nova Scotia, the government of Canada really owes these Caribbean countries a debt of gratitude, and more than lip service. Oh, we're sorry. That's fine. That's the beginning, but they have to come up. They have to deal it in a real, concrete, material way. And yeah, I'll just read this part. It says, establish memoranda of understanding with post-secondary institutions in the Caribbean to engage in research of mutual interest and, as appropriate, and as reparations to help them build capacity. Provide funding to support these links. Support and promote research on health challenges that disproportionately affect Black community. So our recommendations were well thought out. They're are very comprehensive. Yeah.
Well done to you and your team for the awesome work that you've done and that you're doing. It's I mean, without people like you, digging in, in spite of whatever ugliness you're going to find, a lot of it would remain, unknown to us.
No, and this is a way that these stories were made to be invisible, because they are not in the history books. The white story, whether it's French or British, keeps being repeated over and over and over again. The last segregated school in Nova Scotia closed in the 1990s. In Ontario, it was 1964. So, and we haven't even talked about slavery itself in Canada or in Nova Scotia, which was for the longest while was a dominant condition of Black people in the province. We touched on the connection to slavery in the West Indies. But the two slavery systems were not mutually exclusive, because sometimes when slave masters in Nova Scotia, for whatever reason, maybe they were in financial straits, they would sell their slaves to the West Indies. That was
Nova Scotia.
Yes, or they would sell them to the American South.
Wow.
So that's for another time.
Yes, that's really news to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really look forward to having you back, not just for you to continue to tell us more of your findings with regard to slavery, but have you back as a poet, as a creative writer. I really look forward to having you back again.
For sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. So, do you think more universities should be made accountable for their role in slave trade and for benefiting from slave trading and wealth acquired from slave trade? Please share your opinion on our community page and do give us a thumbs up, and feel free to share our videos. Thank you.